My name is Mark Depew, the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. Today is November 9th, 2012. I'm back in rural Plano, Illinois, and I'm talking to the former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Denny Hastert. Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning. You're right on the edge of Kendall County. You know, I was born on, or grew up on one side of Kendall County, and I'm going to probably die on the other side of Kendall County, but it's been my home all my life.
Well, we had a great session yesterday, and we got to know who you were, who you are, and by talking about your background and all that hard labor you did, and always doing something. That was what impressed me in reading the book and our conversation yesterday. You didn't shy away from work ever, not a single day in your life, as far as I can tell. I wanted to start with this question. Your title of your book, Speaker, Lessons from 40 Years in Coaching and Politics. And what struck me there was your inclusion of the word coaching in that title. Because most people, the only reason they're going to pick it up is because you were the third most influential, you were the third person on the constitutional, what's the terminology here?
The third line for the presidency, basically.
Third line for the presidency. So, and you're one of the most powerful men in the United States, and yet you include the word coaching in your title.
Well, you know, I always learn you are what you are, and you can't pretend not to be what your background is. And, you know, I spent 16 years, 17 years actually coaching, counted a year at college, and I think coaching develops basically, it's a whole philosophy of mentorship, and it's how you, in a sense, how you approach life. Time out.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here.
So every mentorship was basically a part of your philosophy in coaching, and that's to, you know, bring people along and give them success. And I think I really kind of applied that to my legislative time and my time in Congress as well. Is that I had another interesting philosophy, is that if the coach was in the headline every week, the team was in trouble. If the team was in the headline every week, they're doing pretty good. So it was always my view of for the greater good to get people involved and get a team together and move stuff forward. It took the self-centeredness out of the political process. And, you know, even in my tenure as Speaker, one of the things I tried to do is bring, I thought, promising young folks up and give them a chance to succeed. And I also, it was my modus operandi in leadership. Newt Gingrich, who was my predecessor, basically everything was about Newt. And when there was a success, he was the guy that did the interview. He was the guy that did the press conference. What I try to do is get legislation, you know, plant the seeds in the committee, have to go through the committee process, subcommittee, committee, have it build up, and then have the committee take the emphasis and give them the success. If you give the chairman and the lower in the committee members the ability to get things done, then they take a pride in it, and you have a better team operation. I think that was really one of the keys. You know, when I became Speaker, I never dreamed I'd ever be Speaker for first place. Secondly, I never thought I'd be there for 8 years. It was a tough spot. But our modus operandi of bringing things up through the committees and having the committees take the credit for getting it done, I think was a very successful measure. Then, you know, if you had to deal with the Vice President and the President and the Senate, you went ahead and did it, but you had your people get the job done.
Does that mean that you're not concerned that you're not anywhere near as well known as either Newt Gingrich or Nancy Pelosi?
Well, that was part of my philosophy. You know, as I said, if the coach is in the headlines, the team's in trouble. When Gingrich is in the headlines all the time when he was Speaker, it means people are taking him on, and he was, you know, being prosecuted or this or that. The same thing with Pelosi. She was very controversial. You know, what did Nancy Pelosi get done? You know, really, as far as moving legislative, got the health care thing done, but it was pushed by the president to do it. But even when she did that, you know, I see her modus operandi. She had what I call the imperial style of being a speaker. You know, everything she did was top down, And so she had a guy named George, I'll think of it later, but he was from the San Francisco Bay Area, same as her. She was from San Francisco, he was from there, George Miller. And Miller had been there for a long time. I think he came in 1974, still there. And but you know, Miller was always the guy behind the scenes. He was kind of the Wizard of Oz. So he was the guy behind the curtain, pulling the wires and pushing the buttons and getting things done. But everything came from her office, from the top down, and not from the bottom up. And so the controversy was always there, that people were throwing the spears at her, even from her own party. And so I think when I look at the issues that I got involved in, even in the legislature, I mean, I did a lot of property reform for education, because I thought there was an inequality, because we paid for our property taxes, 75% of our property taxes in suburban and rural areas goes for education.
Now, you're talking about at the
state level.
Legislature?
Yeah, we're moving to state legislature. So all that from our property taxes goes to education, and the property taxes are assessed differently in outside of Cook County and inside of Cook County. Inside of Cook County, there's a quadrennial assessment, so they're only assessed once every 4 years instead of every year like we are. And also, their domiciles or houses, domestic properties, are assessed at 16% instead of 33 and a third. And to make up for it, they're supposed to assess the commercial properties at 40% higher. So it's higher than what they would do. Well, it never works out. And it's a political system in Chicago that drives that, because if you have the right lawyer, as a matter of fact, Mike Madigan's law practice is to represent taxpayers before the tax appeal board. So if you get the right lawyer, vis-a-vis Mike Madigan or Jim Houlihan or one of those Chicago guys to represent you, you're going to get your taxes cut. And so what happens, there's a low input of property taxes that support Chicago education. So basically, Chicago education is supported by your income tax. So there's an inequity there. So everybody out of Chicago pays for their education with their property tax. Basically, Chicago people pay for their education with other people's income tax. There's two, but other people's, because of the school aid formula. It's an inequity. So I went on and took that on and tried to fight that fight. And what happened, you had suburban areas overappraised. And so people were paying really a lot of money on their property taxes. And so I put in a piece of legislation. It was a kind of a carrot and no stick. But we found that there's every township has their own assessor. And if the assessor met the state guidelines in assessing, we gave them a $3,000 stipend. Now people say, you shouldn't give people a stipend to do their jobs. But we found when we did it, all of a sudden the assessments started to come in line, and these assessors really started doing their job. Because if they didn't do their job, they wouldn't get the $3,000 stipend. So it was one of the first major pieces of legislation I did my first year in the legislature. And quite frankly, there was a guy who was an assessor here in Kendall County, as Ray Waclaw, W-A-C-L-A-W. And Ray was a very much a mover and shaker in the assessor world. So he helped me do this. It was really a statewide piece of legislation, important piece of legislation. It affected people statewide. And I got people involved in kind of a team, and I was on the revenue committee, and I got people involved to help to get that done. Tom Ewing was the chairman of that committee at that time, and very helpful in getting it done. And then I got on this, I was on a commission called the Sunset Commission. They got on that right after my first term in the legislature. And that commission really wasn't a very glorious thing, because you met every couple times a month, and you decide, well, here the horseshoers permits coming up, legislation that do you need to have legislation that certifies horseshoers, or guys who are roofers? Do you need to certify roofers, or beauticians, or people who do water witching. I mean, back in the old days, water witching was a big deal, and you had to protect people whether somebody was a verified water witcher or if he was just a fraud. So there was legislation. Do you need to have that today? I mean, how many water witchers do you have? So I mean, it was kind of an archaic type of work, but in that time, there were two pieces of legislation that came up. The public utility came up, the bill that granted the public utilities to work, and then had the Illinois Commerce Commission that controlled them. And so it was basically the basis for the Illinois Commerce Commission. And a couple of guys that were on my committee who were probably senior to me, one was Bob Custra, a Republican from the suburbs, went from the House to the Senate. Another guy was he was over from Charleston, Illinois. He became a judge. And so I became the senior guy on that committee, the guy who had worked and did the background and really learned about this stuff. So when we went to form the committee, lo and behold, I became the chairman of this committee. And
which committee again was this?
It was the committee to rewrite the Public Utility Act and the Telephone Act. Because something else happened in prior to 1984.
Well, if I can butt in here, if you don't mind.
That's your interview.
Well, no, sir, it's your interview. But I wanted to kind of take some steps back and talk about that first campaign a little bit more. So I'll go ahead and let you complete your thought about the Public Utility Act and that thing. But then I'd like to go back and...
So what we did in the Public Utility Act, something else happened, and it was the rewrite of the Telephone Act, because there's a guy from Plainfield, Illinois named Jack Goken, G-O-E-K-E-N, I believe it is, Goken, who sued AT&T, and out of that lawsuit became the Judge Green decision. And the Judge Green decision broke down the Telephone Act, so AT&T had to divest of all its local telephone companies. So it broke up into 7 companies. Illinois Bill, or Ameritech, actually became our Midwestern representative. So it was a gigantic piece of legislation. Here, this huge companies being divested, and so you had to figure out how you made telephone service. And so we wrote the first real in-depth Telephone Act that went together with that Public Utility Act. And I had Don Clark Netsch was my co-chairman. A guy named Alice Levin, who also was a Democrat, on that committee, very much a consumer advocate. So it was a very, very interesting committee. We had lots of hearings. I mean, we had a whole year of hearings.
This was joint House and Senate?
Yeah, and both on the House side and both on the telephone side and the electric side. So it was an education in itself, and a very heavy undertaking. Now, Jim McPike was the guy who kind of monitored the thing for the speaker. And there's something I always said that in politics, that and probably anything you do, business or coaching, but knowledge is power. And we really worked at it, and I had a director that he and I really ran the committee. His name was Greg Busch, G-R-E-G-G-B-U-S-C-H, Bush. And Greg was a very cerebral guy, and he really understood both the utility issues and the telephone issues. And we got into it, and we kind of ran the thing because we knew more about it than anybody else. And so we wrote the Public Utility Act and the Telephone Act, passed it in 1984. But it was a huge, huge piece of legislation. And when you learn more than anybody else, then people come to you for information. At the same time, I was doing appropriations, and I was the Republican leader. Jim Riley was my seatmate, my first term in the second term in the legislature. And Riley was kind of a mover and shaker. He was from Jacksonville, Illinois, very smart guy, and Thompson tapped him to become his deputy governor. And so Riley left, and when Riley left, a couple of these guys, Artie Telser, who was one of the leaders, who was also a pharmacist. We were talking about a pharmacist before. Was also a pharmacist from Chicago. Said, let's put Hastert in this spot. And so I ended up taking Riley's spot, and he was the leader on appropriations. And we didn't have the majority, but we controlled the bills because Thompson was the governor. So if you had the governor, up until we did that probably until 92 or 94 in the legislature, I guess. But we controlled the bills, the appropriation bills, and so we could call them. We couldn't control the amendments that went on them, but obviously the majority did. But I ended up in with those things with a lot of, without being in a leadership position, with just a lot of credibility. I wouldn't say necessarily raw power, but credibility, because first of all, if you controlled the appropriation process, you really controlled what the strings of government, and then taking on this big responsibility. But part of it was just who was willing to do the work.
Well, and as we started today, you had a reputation for doing the work. Now, in your younger years, it was physical work. Now it's, you talked about in your younger years, you weren't hitting the books very hard. You obviously had changed that in the equation.
Well, also, if you were, I became probably in a person, I would say, tell me. Don't write it, just tell me, brief me. And, obviously in the legislative process, you have to have a lot of hearings, and you have to have some good staff. And I've always been blessed that whether I was in the legislature or in the Congress, I always had good staff. And, staff did a lot of the hard work, a lot of the research and stuff, and they brought that information. I always said every day that I was in the legislature and every day I was in Congress, it was like a college education, because you had so much stuff to absorb. And I mean, in every area you get in, if you're doing healthcare, there's a whole set of acronyms for healthcare. If you're doing telecommunications, there's a whole set of acronyms and jargon for telecommunications. If you're doing energy, there's a whole set of acronyms and jargon for energy. And you really had to understand what those things. So one of the things I've always said, if people are coming up and giving testimony or talking to you, and they're using a lot of jargon and kind of giving you a snow job, I always stop them. I said, what does this mean? What's this acronym mean? What are you talking about? How does this fit? And so I learned more through an audio type of learning rather than reading. And I could read and I could write if I had to, but I really depended on good staff telling me the right things, and just the testimony that you would have in hearings.
How about the role of lobbyists? I would think complex bills like this public utility bill and the telecommunications bill, and the people who had the knowledge, like it or not, are the lobbyists who are representing those groups.
When I did the telecommunications, I had a guy that was a lobbyist for Illinois Bell, and he was, first of all, he was a good friend of Tom Ewing, so there was a credibility there. And he was just a good guy, straight guy. Jack, and I'm trying to think, it's not Sechrist, but it's a word like Sechrist. But, I talk to him all the time. I said, well, how does this work? And Bush, Greg Bush, who was my chief of staff, he would get into the weeds on this thing. How does all this work? How did the interconnection and the switches? And, when we did this, we didn't have PCs. You didn't have cell phones. You didn't have, Wi-Fi's. There wasn't Twitter. There wasn't blogs, and none of this stuff existed. And none of it existed until after we made telecom competitive. So the whole world of this new age of communications never happened until we broke down AT&T and put in the world of competition. And when people started to be able to have handheld telephones, and you had to have systems to do it, people were free to compete to do it instead of a monopoly doing it. So it was really opened up the whole world of communication. I'm not saying we created the internet. I don't take that credit, but we opened up the world that communications could take place.
You presented in the book that your legislation was kind of at the cutting edge of this, that a lot of other states then
Because I
used you
remember
as a model.
after we did that, I went to what is it, the American Association of State Legislatures and all those groups, and we presented how we did it. I mean, we became the matrix for how those things got put together, template.
Okay, I'm going to pull you way back then. We talked very briefly yesterday. You talked about the first campaign running for Congress, but I wanted to spend a lot more time about it.
Congress or legislature?
Excuse me, the legislature.
Okay.
And before I even get to that point, I want to get kind of to place it into the time frame of what's going on politically, economically in the United States. So let's start with, let's start in the state or the national level
Well,
first.
let's start, 1974, the Republican Party took a huge drubbing after Nixon stepped down. There was just a surge of Democrats that took into the Congress. And basically it was not just nationwide, it was statewide as well. And Chicago basically was the power center of Illinois because they were the majority of the majority. So anything that got done was basically really at the behest of Mayor Daley. He was the guy who pulled the strings in Chicago and the Democratic Party. Jimmy Carter beat Ford in 1976. And in 1976, I was certainly not in politics. I was very much ensconced in teaching and coaching. We were state champions that year in wrestling. And 1978, I became the president of State Coaches Association, did some grassroots door-to-door kind of lobbying in Washington on the National Sports Act, and was moving through Congress. And I decided, God, these guys are like anybody else. And not that I wasn't very much involved in politics, but I taught economics, I taught government, I taught history. So, I was doing the substance of what legislation, and I had moved, as a coach, I had moved some legislation, sports legislation. I created the class system in Illinois, and we're doing those types of things. So I was involved in getting consensus and getting things done. And we had to do that through the Illinois High School Association. I became a member of their advisory board. And so, I was doing these types of things, which are actually sports politics. And, we're fighting this fight between the AAU and the U.S. Wrestling Federation, who had the sanction of having the say. So we were saying that we should have the sanction of the U.S. Wrestling Federation as opposed to the AAU, because the AAU was a good old boy YMCA outfit, and the Wrestling Federation was really grassroots coaches. And so we were fighting that. It was basically a political battle of a kind. So I had cut my teeth basically on that type of stuff. So I'm just laying the framework.
Well, I'm wondering, seeing politicians in action in Washington, D.C., I guess you talk about, made you conclude, well, they're no different than me.
Yes, yeah.
But what was it that made you think, I want to get involved in politics?
Well, let me say, I was always interested. I remember watching the conventions in 1952 when Kefauver and Stevenson and Eisenhower and Taft, and so I was 8 years old. But I sat there all summer long and watched those conventions, and I was just intrigued by them. And that's when the conventions were really conventions. And then, of course, you had the fight in 1960 with Nixon and Kennedy, and went through the whole convention process in West Virginia and all those things. And so I was always intrigued by it. Never ever thought I'd have a place in it, because I just didn't think a kid from the cornfields would actually ever have a chance to do anything like that. So, but I taught about it and analyzed it, and was part of my thinking all the time. I remember taking my family on a vacation in 1976, in the summer of '76, and we're up in Wisconsin, and the kids were really small. I mean, Ethan was just a year and a half, 2 years old, 2.5 years old, and Josh was probably 5, I guess, something like that. And I was in the motel, and the convention was on, so I'm watching this thing with Teddy Kennedy and Kennedy I'm sorry, this is 1980 convention, and with Jimmy Carter and the battles that were going on. The kids were sound asleep, and I'm sitting up in the middle of the night watching this convention on TV in a motel room. But so I always had that type of interest. Ronald Reagan, an Illinois guy, worked his way up for the presidency. And you had George Bush, and you had Dan Crane or Phil Crane from Illinois, and all these guys who were in the primaries. The Republican leader from Tennessee became the ambassador to Japan. I'll think of it in a second. He married a senator. Anyway, still alive. Well, anyway, they were all in this primary, and
You're talking about Howard Baker?
Howard Baker, yeah. So these were all in the Republican primary in 1980. So I really had kind of got involved, and so this was in the summer of 1980. I had taken an internship with the Taft Foundation. I think it was Taft Foundation, and then two of them actually. And I went down and actually did an internship with John Grotberg, who was a state senator, and basically as a teacher, to get a real feel of what the legislature was about. And this was sponsored, I think, by University of Illinois Springfield, I think. And then it was all through the Teachers Association. And then I took this Taft Institute, I think it was. And it was up in Loyola University. And it brought in all the, not all brought, but a lot of congressmen. And I remember George Dunn came in and talked to us, and he was the chairman of the Cook County Board. And I remember George Dunn talking about dealing with Jimmy Carter. And a comment by Dunn looked at us and said, well, I told that guy that he can't do that. And I'm thinking, here's this guy who has this really a power broker in Chicago. And he's telling the President of the United States what he can do and what he can't do. And I'm thinking, it's an amazing process. I told you I came home one October afternoon in 1979, and I was teaching, and I saw this thing that there was Bill Kempner's, we talked about yesterday, step down. I could do that job. And so I went, and you had to get your petitions out, so I got some people, some teachers and friends of mine, and passed, I think you had to have 350 signatures to get on the ballot. So I got the 350 signatures, took it down to Springfield, filed it, and the next day I get this call from Dallas Ingemanson, who's the Kendall County chairman. Basically, what the hell are you trying to do? I said, what do you mean? Oh, you filed for state rep. Yeah. So you've never been to a precinct committee meeting, or you've never been involved in the Republican Party. Why do you think you can do this? I said, well, I'm sorry, I just never thought about it. I'd come down and talk to you. So I came down and talked to him. A great guy. And, Al, basically, Ingemanson, I always thought I had good mentors. Ingemanson became my mentor. He was very, he knew who the players were. He's a friend with Pate Phillip. He had friends on both sides of the aisle. And he was a state's attorney, but had been a state's attorney for a long time. Not much older, a couple years older than I am. But he just knew the process and really kind of walked me through the process. So by the end of that primary time, I think the primary was in February or 1st of March, end of February, 1st of March, something like that. He was basically a supporter, and I had the support of Kendall County. However, they had already decided who the nominee was going to be for the vacancy. It was a guy from Joliet, and the district covered 4 counties. It had Kendall County, Kane County, Will County, and a little bit of DuPage County, so at Naperville, and a good part of DuPage County. So there's 4 county chairmen, and we were just the smallest county and had the smallest part of that district. But Ingemanson stood behind me all this way, this process. Well, it was Kempener's. There was an old guy who had been in the legislature forever, and I'll think of his name in a minute.
Alan Schoberlein?
Schoberlein. It's a German name. Schoberlein. Schoberlein, I believe it is. And he was from the west side of Aurora. And he was running. And so for this open seat, all of a sudden you had Suzanne Deutschler. You had a guy named Gould from Joliet. You had another guy who just kind of came out of the woodwork, and I did, and I came out. I'm
going to stick my nose in here again, and then we'll get back on this. First of all, I wanted to ask you, was Jean at all surprised when you decided you wanted to do this?
Well, I remember her coming home from school, and we sat down and talked. I said, I think I'd like to do that. And she looked at me and said, well, if you want to do it, go ahead. But,
It sounds like she wasn't all that convinced that you'd be able to pull it off.
Well, she was a Democrat from Southern Illinois. Her dad was a part of the Democrat Party down in Macoupin County, where they didn't have Republicans down there. And I think she was a little bit taken back. That was, what's all this Republican stuff about anyway? But anyway, you won't find anybody more conservative today than my wife. But she so if you really want to do this, go ahead. Very tolerant. So I did. And
well, here's the other, and sorry to keep interrupting here, but I think we probably ought to lay out for the people who are going to read this the cumulative voting process in Illinois, because otherwise you just don't understand.
I was going to get into that.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So this election, all of a sudden you had four candidates on the Republican side for one spot. But you had you had five candidates for two spots. So the cumulative voting, the system prior to 1982, and incidentally, the Constitution was basically changed by a guy who's governor now named Quinn. But they reduced the size of the House from I think 177 members to 118 members, if I'm correct. And so every senatorial district had 3 House districts, and it was set up during the time of the Civil War, because basically downstate Illinois, anything south of Springfield, was all Democrat. It was Dixie, and everything north of Springfield was basically Republican. Chicago was a Republican city. The first big Jim Thompson or Bill Thompson was a big mayor of Chicago, was a Republican, and it was all part of the system. And so evidently the forefathers of our state were concerned about minority voting. So every district had 2 majority and 1 minority. So if you were in downstate, basically every district had 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, unless you were in Springfield or East St. Louis or a place like that, or deep in the south part of the state. And every place in Chicago, up in the suburbs, had 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And you get in the city, and you had 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. So that's how it shook out. And so every Senate district had 3 House seats. Well, you could, if you were in a heavy Democrat district, the 2 top winners that would take the 2 Democrat seats could have, they could have, let's say, 50,000 votes. And incidentally, every person who voted had 3 votes. Okay, so they could get 50 or 60,000 votes, and then everybody. I'm sorry. I think everybody had 2 votes. Did they have 3 votes? 3 votes. Okay. So
and I know they could vote for 3 different people. They could vote for 1 person who got 3 votes. They could vote for 2 people who each got a vote and a half.
Yeah. If you voted for somebody that had 3 votes, that was called a shot, and so all 3 votes went to 1 candidate. So it was a very you never knew how those numbers were going to come down. But Democrats would usually give a shot for their guy, and the Republicans, if you were in a Republican, would split their vote or give a shot to one or give 2 and 1 or whatever they did. But candidates were always getting for wanting the straight vote. They wanted all 3 votes. So I was in this race, and all of a sudden in this thing was this very complicated voting scheme, and I came in. Well, Suzanne Deutschler had all the women behind her. It was also the time of the ERA, and so it's a big issue. And so I think she got basically all the women's vote, Republican and Democrat. She was a League of Women Voters, and she was a University and Professional Women, and all these groups she had. A network, and you go knocking on doors, and first a woman would come to the door, west side of Aurora, said, well, where are you on the ERA? It was the first question out of their mouth. So Deutschler won. First of all, the old guy won. Schoberlein. He was a top vote getter. Well, I think Deutschler was the first top vote getter. And Schoberlein, who was the old timer, he was over 80 years old. And then there was a African American guy, I believe African American, a barber from Aurora, who got maybe 3% of the vote, but was the majority of the Democrat vote.
Well, from the book, I think you had two other names: Don Gould, George Wendt.
George Gould and Wendt are the Republicans that were in the primary.
Okay.
And then but in the primary, you're talking about the two guys that won, was Deutschler and Schoberlein, and then there's a Democrat in too, and I think it was a barber. And I don't know if I have a name down there or not.
Lazarus Murphy.
Oh, Laz Murphy, yeah, he wasn't a barber. He was an old-time Democrat from Aurora, and he was there forever. But there was a couple other guys in this race, but Laz Murphy.
From what I understand about cumulative voting, once it got to the general election, there was typically two people from each party on the ballot.
Yeah. So it was Laz Murphy and this other guy on the Democrat side. So he had four people, and went to the primary. And I didn't win it, so it was a scramble. Gould had the Will County vote. I had kind of a mixed bag, and Wendt had a little bit of Aurora.
What was your thought after you lost in the primary?
Well, look at nothing ventured, nothing gained, and I went on, and so that next summer, then I took these two institutes just to learn more because I was going to teach the political course, and so I got this Taft Institute up in Chicago, and I did this thing with I think with the Teachers Association or something through the University of Illinois at Springfield. I think that's what it was, their political science.
Sangamon State at the time.
Sangamon State, yeah. And so I was an intern to John Grotberg, who also happened to be the state senator, but he also happened to be the county chairman for King County. And so I was ready to go back to school, and I was chairman of the social science department, but I was chairman of all the teachers. So I had gotten a grant for the teachers and working on them, being able to incorporate history and government into their classes, 4th grade teachers, 5th grade teachers, and I was really into that. And one of the most frustrating things was getting teachers to change their curriculum, and getting to go to these workshops and changing their curriculum. So I was really involved with that. And all of a sudden, right in the middle of this thing in August, when I was doing this project, Schoberlein has a stroke. I don't know if he's going to run. And so the very end of August, or 1st of September, Schoberlein resigns his nomination. So now this whole thing about who becomes the candidate is up to the county chairman. And so the decision was the county chair. There's a big golf outing every year in DuPage County. It's over at St. Andrews Golf Course. So the players were a guy named Lou Yangus, who was the county chairman for Will County. Do you need another sheet of paper?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Lou Yangus was the chairman for Will County. Dallas Ingemunson was the chairman for Kendall. Pate Phillip was the chairman for DuPage, and John Grotberg was the chairman for Will King County. So the deal was in for Gould, because he was kind of the favored candidate when they went into the primary, and that was an old agreement. Well, Dallas stepped back and said, look, I can't agree to it. I got this guy, Hastert. And, of course, Grotberg, I got to know him very well, but he was party to this agreement, but he was very uncomfortable with it. And so Pate Phillip had made his pledge to Yangus on Gould, and so I didn't look like I was going to win this thing. But Kane County also had another candidate, and it was a guy who was assistant to a retired guy from a Navy captain. Ran his own business, retired businessman, and so he was kind of the guy. And one of the very powerful groups in Illinois, in the Fox Valley area, I would say, was the Fox Valley Industrial Association. So this guy was the candidate for basically the Industrial Association, and I'll think of his name in a minute. He actually became an employee of mine, or when I became speaker. But good guy. And he and I went to this thing, and we knew this was going to go late hours, and so he became the Kane County candidate. And what's his name? I'll think of it. But anyway, Ginny and I think it was his wife's name. Anyway, he was from the west side of Aurora. So he became the Kane County candidate. So they went up into these county chairmen, and they didn't have weighted votes. Each county chairman had equal vote. So they went up in this meeting. I went home. I said, I'm not going to stay for this. So I went home. I didn't think I was going to get it anyway. And went home and went to bed. I had school the next day. And I think the other candidate from Aurora, he went home. And so what happened, they went upstairs in the card room of this St. Andrews Golf Club, and Dallas and Pate and Senator Grotberg, John Grotberg, and Lou Yankus.
I know that Pate Phillips smoked a cigar.
Oh yeah,
This
I'm
is
sure
the classic smoke-filled room.
Smoke-filled room, and so the vote started, and each had an equal vote. So, and you had to have a majority to win. So you had 4 counties. So I started out, and Yangus was for Gould, Dallas was for me, Grotberg was for Frank Gurry, Gurry. And he was Chauberlain's assistant, so he was the prodigal son to move forward and take the spot. And so this wasn't the old spot, so the guys looked at it as a new spot. So Gurry was the guy. Pate went along with Gould because he had to deal with Yangus, and of course Yangus was for Gould. So there was no majority. And so the next vote, Dallas had talked to Grotberg. Grotberg fulfilled his obligation to vote for Gurry, but he also knew me because I basically was his intern that summer. And Grotberg was a rough old guy, but he was kind of a YMCA guy, and did that kind of stuff. And he was a chairman of ran the Hotel Baker in St. Charles. And I mean, that's his background. He was in the state legislature and then moved up to the Senate. And he liked to take a drink in the afternoon. Of course, I grew up in the restaurant business. I could mix a pretty good Manhattan up. Go get a Manhattan. So I go get a Coke cup and back in his office, mix up a Manhattan and make a couple of them. He had a couple of buddies in the sector. So they'd be sitting in the back row of the Senate at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd go mix up these Manhattans and take them to him. So I knew John pretty well. He thought I made a pretty good Manhattan. But anyway, they'd sip these doubles and they'd get through the rest of the afternoon. And so we had a good relationship. And so John switched his vote from Gurry to me. So they went around to the vote again. It was Gould, Hastert. And so they're deadlocked. And this is getting late at night. And Dallas was a good friend of Pate. And Dallas said, wait, why don't you just come for, Hastert's a good guy.
Was Pate Phillip the Senate minority leader at the time?
Yeah. Yeah, because the guy who was the majority leader, no, he wasn't. He was minority leader. He wasn't a minority leader because, the guy who just died was a guy from...
I should know that, and I can't recall him.
Yeah, a nice guy. It was a Jewish name, but he was, I think, he was a Senate leader at that time, and he had just passed away. I don't think we had the majority in the Senate, but I'm not sure. I think Phil Rock was the president of the Senate at that time. So anyway, Pate was, of course, the anointed leader, at least at that point. And so Pate says, I'm not going to vote for that guy. He's a school teacher. He's probably owned by the Illinois Education Association. And Dallas said, he's not. He's a school teacher. He's a coach, and he's not, he's not a bad guy. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, I get this phone call, and it's Pate Phillip. Well, this is Pate Phillip. We're talking about your nomination. He says, how much money did you get from the IEA? I said, first of all, they didn't endorse me, in the primary, and I think I got $300. Oh, shit, that's nothing. Those tight wads. Yeah, okay. So he changed his vote. So the final vote came Kendall County, Hastert, Kane County, Hastert, DuPage County, Hastert, and Gould. So, after about 3 or 4 rounds of voting, it ended up, I got it in the smoke-filled room. And I'm telling you that as a second, not being there in person, but as the story has been related to me by several different people.
Well, I've interviewed Senator Phillip, and know that his reputation, you probably couldn't get anybody who was less politically correct in his career and more blunt and colorful in the things he said.
Yeah.
Well, what did you think when you got this news? Because you walked out thinking you weren't going to get it.
Well, then all of a sudden, here it is, Labor Day, and I'm immersed in a campaign. And so now I got to raise money, because then you had this bullet voting, and you had Laz Murphy and this guy who was a barber on the west side of Aurora, and you had Suzanne Deutschler and me. And Deutschler was still going for the bullet vote, had all the women, and I had Laz Murphy, was popular, and
but we're talking about a strongly Republican district, right?
Yeah. So basically, but if all the votes, all the female votes went for Deutschler in the time of the ERA issue, at least people who had that persuasion. So I had to go for the right. There were a lot of women who were against the ERA. So you got yourself in a trap, but you had to politically, and so I ended up being opposed to the ERA.
Was that your motivation? Was primarily to find that issue that you could draw enough votes to get elected?
Well, a part of it was I really believe that our Constitution covered the issue. I really believe it opened up to other, it was a national issue, it wasn't a state issue.
And this has been an issue that from 1972 on in the Illinois State Legislature was fought over every single year in both the House and the Senate.
I'll get into that story. Okay.
Great.
So anyway, here I was, I'm running, and this is a big issue, and you're either for it or against it. And I thought, you can't be halfway. And there's a lot of Republicans that weren't for it, and so, and that basically represented where I was in Kendall County and my constituency. So I took an opposition against it. And I'm basically right to life, and that's been my persuasion. And I don't wave that bloody flag all the time, but people want to know that's where I'm at. I believe in the sanctity of life, and so abortion and stuff was very much involved in this whole ERA thing. And so, I ended up, and we had another guy by the name of Bob Michler, who had been in the state senate and lost the primary to a guy named Forrest Etheridge, who was the president of Waubonsee Community College. And that was going on at the same time. And Michler was never very happy about my candidacy. I mean, I was surprised. I surprised Dallas Ingevinson, but Michler was really pissed at me when that happened, because he didn't think Kendall County was big enough for 2 legislators, and he was a state senate guy, and he was, we were the smallest county in this convergence of counties, and very close to Shoverline, and so I mean, Michler just died a couple months ago, and let me say this, and I'll try to say it as politically correct as possible. Bob always had an opinion about something, but he never did very much, if you understand what I'm talking about. So it wasn't really a workhorse. And so anyway, I really didn't have, he was just lukewarm on my candidacy, and he was out of the picture. But he had he was always stirring up a lot of problems as far as my supporters, as opposed to Shoverline. So he was kind of pushing people for Shoverline. So even my own base, I had this split. So I had to be strong, and I had to raise money. I remember a friend of mine who helped me, actually, just a local guy, Dave Todd, T-O-D-D, lived in Yorkville, and he had a small manufacturing firm in Aurora. And but he also assisted me on the wrestling team. He helped me out, just came and worked with my kids, and he worked with the bigger kids. He was a great guy. And he gave me $1,000. My God, $1,000. I mean, how could anybody give me $1,000? I was getting, I remember the first fundraiser I had. I had an uncle that had a restaurant over in North Aurora called the Toll Gate Inn, and so it was a Sunday night or a Monday when he wasn't open. So we had a fundraiser there, and my first fundraiser, I think there were 12 people there. And there was this old guy named Stan Sarwick, S-A-R-W-A-R-O-K, I believe it is. But he was a Commonwealth Edison guy. I remember he was there, and but he was a utility lobbyist. But I think that this first lobby dollar I ever got out of 12 people, I probably made $120. I don't know, but it was just tough to raise money, and I didn't have any money. But I ended up putting about $2,000 of my own money in. It was a lot of money for me. I mean, I was a teacher's salary.
Was that in the general campaign or the primary?
That was I think it was probably in the general. I didn't usually hardly any money at all in the primary. I bought some signs and some bumper stickers, and we did handouts, but not much. And so all of a sudden there's some money that started dribbling in, and I got elected. And I think I came in, I don't know if I came in second or if I came in third. I think I beat Laz Murphy. So Susan Deutschler was first, I was second, and Murphy was third on the cumulative voting. So here I was, but I went to work, and I always believed just in where my values and my worth was. I believed I got stuff done by working hard. I did that in coaching, I did it in teaching, and did it in other things. So my philosophy as a legislator was always being a workhorse and not so much a show horse. And it goes back to your question before, being in a lot of interviews and TV and Pelosi and Gingrich. I said I don't need to be on TV all the time. I just need to get work done, and that's always been my philosophy.
When you got elected, that would have been November. Does that mean that you resign your teaching and coaching positions?
No, I didn't, because you can teach and coach at the same time. And I thought, well, maybe I can do this. And I had a team coming up. November we were already practicing. And I remember running in that primary or in the general, and I'd have practice, and I'd go out to Shorewood or Naperville and knock on doors. I really spent a lot of time doing this.
But certainly when the legislature is in session, you were going to be able to do both.
Well, here's what happened. I mean, we didn't go into session until January. The season was pretty much over by then. I don't know when it was, but it was mid-January, I think, when we were sworn in. We were sworn in at the same time that Ronald Reagan was sworn in, so I was the 20th of January. But, we had political meetings, and, you had the selection, and you had an orientation and all that stuff. But I was able to do that. So I was coaching, and I was teaching full-time, coaching full-time. There was another guy from Bensonville High School who was he was a buddy of Lee Daniels, and I'm trying to think of his name. Started with an H too, but he was a former wrestling coach, a social science coach, and he said, you can do this, but he wasn't coaching. So I remember after I was sworn in, it was the end of the season, late January. So you had a couple of dual meets, and we had the state tournament series, the conference championship and state tournament series, and so I would go and teach all day. I'd have my practice from like 3 o'clock until 5 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and then get in a car, drive to Springfield. And I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, drive to Springfield, and then be there to open the session. And go through the session. We get done at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, get in the car, drive home, then have practice and I had to leave. I had a teaching leave at that time. I had somebody do a substitute teaching for 6 weeks. So I come in and have somebody, and I would have practice at like 6 o'clock. Have practice 6 to 8, go home, sleep, get up at 4 o'clock, drive to Springfield. I was figuring, it was the end of the season, so I could really do that. But I thought, God, this will kill you. And but I did it, and realized that I really can't do it. So I finished out that year. I took a leave for 6 weeks when we were in heavy part of the session.
But you're talking about the spring of '81. You were still trying to do this every day.
Yeah. Oof. I did it until the end of the wrestling season. The end of the wrestling season was probably the end of February, 1st of March. And then at the end of that, I remember I came back and taught the rest of the year. And so we must have been done, because I did come back and teach. And I'm not sure how that worked out.
Well, I know that the legislative cycle was, the beginning of the fiscal year was 1 July, so most of the
Everything
work was done
1st
by
June. So anyway, I did that for the rest of the year. But it was really hard during the wrestling season. I remember I had 6 guys for the state tournament, which was big. And we didn't do that well, but we did have 6 guys in the state tournament.
A couple more questions about the campaign season. You mentioned ERA, and that was such a hot topic at the time. You remember any other issues?
Well, yeah, Reagan was running. So, here's just.
And the economy was in the tank.
First of all, interest rates were 16, 17%. I remember my father-in-law died in 1976, and so we had essentially, the family, there were 3 brothers, and they had no will. So they had this, probably 600 acres of farmland down there together. It was a family conglomeration. Everybody, all the brothers wrote out of the same checkbook. I mean, groceries, cars, new refrigerators, whatever. It was a mess. So you had to divide all that up, and so we decided that there wasn't. And then you had a state inheritance tax, and then Reagan was trying to move through on remove the inheritance tax or reduce the inheritance tax. So all these things were going on, and we ended up buying a farm because my mother-in-law, the interest rates were so high, she didn't want to farm anymore. So when it broke it up, there was, I don't know how many acres, probably 280 acres or something that ended up in our estate. Well, we really couldn't farm it, so we sold the fence and the cattle and tractors and the combines to the other part. So there's some cash coming in, enough cash to pay the inheritance tax. So we ended up with this land, but nothing to farm it with. So we let the brothers farmed it and then paid so much. I don't know, 50-50 or rent or whatever. But so we weren't making a lot of money off this farm, and so Jean's mother, who's still alive, I think she's 94 years old. Jean's mother decided, look, she's going to make more. Interest rates were 16 and 17%. She's going to make more money buying a CD. So she forced us to divide the farm up. So the farm was divided a third and a third, or 3 kids. So she had a third, and then 2/3 went to the kids. So we had a third of 2/3. Her sister had a third of 2/3, and her brother had a third of 2/3. So we basically bought her out. And so we had to come up, and I had to go down to the Farm Credit Authority and get a loan. The loans were like 12 or 14, 15%. And I had a loan on our house, which I think it was at 8%. But that was an older loan. But I thought I'd never see 10% again. And so it was, people couldn't get mortgages. So it was a tough time economically, and
I know there was both high inflation rate and high unemployment rate. So
seniors, high unemployment, and seniors at that time, if you didn't have a cash accrual and be able to put your money in CDs, if you're stuck with a pension, and inflation was going up so high, you're underwater on your pensions. That's why 401ks became popular, because then you could ride whatever the markets were doing. So all this stuff was going on. So it was a very tumultuous time. It really became an election about pocketbook issues. And so one of the things I talked about was taxation and those types of issues. And I ended up on a revenue committee. And Tom Ewing was the chairman of that revenue committee. And there was a guy from Chicago by the name of Jim Keene, who was the ranking member or minority chairman. And I really got to know Jim Keene very well. We became very, very good friends.
I know another issue that was on the ballot. I don't know if this factored into your race. It was on the ballot as a amendment to the Constitution. That was the cutback amendment. You mentioned Pat Quinn. This was when the state was making the decision whether or not to retain the cumulative voting system.
That decision was already made. I think that was on the 76 ballot.
No, that was the 1980 ballot. It went into effect in 1982 because it carried in 1980. The whole beginning of that, if I can interject here just a little bit, 1978, Jim Thompson's running for re-election,
Right.
he makes the promise that if there's any kind of legislative pay increase, he will veto the legislative pay increase. Immediately after the election, the legislature came into session, and there had been a lot of talk about raising the pay rates
Right.
anyway, and they raised their pay something like 40%, and the governors pay 40%, and other state employees. And by that time, this is after the election, Thompson's down on vacation in South Carolina, and immediately vetoes the legislation with an auto pen. So he directs somebody back in Springfield to do that, and gives the legislature more than enough time to, that same day that he vetoes it, they override his veto and put it into effect. And so the whole state goes crazy and says this was...
That was 78.
That was 78.
At the same time, the U.S. Congress increased the per diem that they got. Not their pay raise, but they increased their per diem to go along. So they would get, I think the per diem was like $90 a day if you had to live. And so members of the legislature got the $90 a day too. But the Congress, there was a big blow up about this, and this may be 70, I don't know if this is, no, it was 78, I think. So that was 78 too. So all this happened, so the congressional guys had to roll their per diem back to no per diem, but it left it for the legislature. So we had a $90, $89 or $85 or $90 a day per diem that we got every day that we were in Springfield. But when I went to Congress, it wasn't there.
But anyway, it sounds like the cutback amendment wasn't a big issue in the campaign.
It was just going to happen. People voted for it. And, you know, so I went there. So the first year I was there, it was in the big house. And my desk was way back in the back. I mean, I was in the last row, but I was probably the second to last or third to last row. And we were under, if you know what the house looked like, we were under the
balcony area?
balcony. And so I remember I had a guy named Jesse Jackson. They were talking about the three place ballot. Jesse Jackson was a Democrat, well, I can't say him, he was a Republican, elected as a Republican from Chicago. He was down on the south side.
You're talking about the Jesse Jackson or
No.
a different guy?
So he's a roofer. But he put him on the ballot because his name was Jesse Jackson. The Democrats put him on the ballot as a Republican. And so he'd sit over on our side, and when a vote came up, he would get up on he was a little short guy, he'd get up on his chair and look over and, I'm trying to think of the guy from the north side of Chicago. He would have his, over on the Democrat side, a thumbs up or thumbs down, telling him how to vote. And so, you know, we had these Republicans behind us who were voting with the Democrats. So we had the majority, but we never really had the majority because of the 3-member districts. And we had a bunch of guys who were voting with the Democrats all the time. Now, of course, I told you the story before. You know, Mayor Daley, when he first came to Springfield, was elected as a Republican.
That was way back in the 1930s, I think.
And under the 3-member ballot thing. And, you know, he was there for about 2 hours and switched over to the other side of the aisle. But, you know, that was the old system. I remember I bet, you know, Newt Gingrich was always lecturing all the time, and he was talking about Mayor Daley. I said, we were in a leadership meeting. I said, I bet you don't know that Mayor Daley was actually elected as a Republican. Oh, you're full of bullshit. Yeah. I said, no, it's true. Oh, yeah. I said, I'll bet you $25. Oh, yeah, that's a bet. I'll cover it. So he researched it. He found, I have a check. Now, you know, the whole House Bank thing became a real controversy, I don't know, in 1990 or 92, one of those times. But I have a check from Newt Gingrich for $25 on the House Bank. It was a bet on Mayor Daley. Never did cash it.
I've talked to a lot of Illinois politicians about the cumulative voting system, the cutback amendment, and their views about it. Most of them are very nostalgic for the, you quote, the good old days of cumulative voting.
The big house, yeah. Al Ronan was the guy on the other side of the aisle that would give the thumbs up or thumbs down.
And he was part of the Chicago machine, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, very much.
What is your view about it? Was that a good
Well, you know, it was interesting because when you had the big house, I look at, if you condense really the Republicans and Democrats, the Democrats are the majority of the majority. The Chicago guys, the majority of the majority. So they come out of the Chicago machine. I mean, they're aldermen, or they're, you know, they're the guys who were controlled by the system, the party. And you know, even like a guy like my friend Bill Lipinski. You know, Lipinski was on the city council. Because he was on the city council and he was a ward committeeman, then he became a member of Congress. It was just kind of a system where you grew up from the grassroots. I mean, you never had a chance of being a politician in the system unless you were a son or grassroots. And the first thing I did when I went to the legislature was I got all the books I could on the there was a lot of biographies of Mayor Daley. The old, what's his name?
The journalist.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name either.
Yeah, but anyway.
Reichel.
Reichel had a book. The other guy was Stoltz or something like that. That's not it, but it was like that. You know, he had written a book. Studs, Turkle, had written a couple other books. So I got all the books I could on Daley just to read up to find out who was guys he worked with. And so all the names, you know, like Keene and Maravich and Cullerton and all these names popping up. And you find out that, you know, Mike Madigan was Daley's gopher, started out. And the other guy that worked there was a guy who ended up being the chairman of the Chicago Board of Trade. I mean, these guys not only were in the political system, but they ended up in the other business systems too. And that's where, you know, if you're going to get your start in Chicago, that's what you had to do. So you learned about who these people were, and if you knew where they came from, and, you know, the old term is who their Chinaman was, who pulled their strings, you learned a lot about how the system worked. And, you know, there's a lot of people in the legislature who just never got it. You know, they never figured it out, especially on our side of the aisle. So you had the Chicago guys. Then the other Democrats, of course, in the old system, he had a guy like Las Murphy, who you were from a town like Aurora, had a lot of union representation. You know, but he wasn't part of the Chicago machine. And you had a guy like Glenn Schneider, who was a school teacher from Naperville, who was really probably philosophically liberal, but he wasn't part of the machine. And you probably had a handful, maybe 10 or 12 of these guys spread throughout the state, who, you know, were Democrats, but they weren't controlled Democrats. And so you had and once in a while there was other conservative Democrats too from downstate that really would work across the aisle. So there's more of a bipartisan type of situation. A lot of our women would go over and work with Democrat women on issues because there was that type of a cover. Now, out of Chicago, you always had Republicans that came out of Chicago. Some of them were controlled by the Democrats, like Jesse Jackson and a few of those guys. Some of them were elected and you never saw them. I mean, you used to be able to go up and change your vote after a vote. You know, if you wanted to change your vote, you could.
After you see how the balance sheet was, and then you could vote back to something that was safer politically for you?
And so, you know, you did that occasionally. You thought, well, gee, maybe that was a very good idea. Or maybe I'm on the wrong side of this issue, and you'd change. There was a guy that was always up there. I think his name was Adamowski, and his dad was a famous prosecutor or something in Chicago. But this guy was a member of the legislature. Hell, I never saw him until, you know, he'd show up to change his vote and then disappear in the back room playing cards or doing something someplace. But, you know, he's just never part of so we had a lot of those kind of guys too out of the Chicago thing. They got slated by the Chicago Republican, quote unquote, and, you know, the chairman of the Chicago Republican guy, he was slated. He was a member of the Bob something. He was there, but you know, these guys. But then there were some guys. Artie Telser was a Jewish guy from the northern suburbs or northern part of Chicago, north side of Chicago. But, you know, he was on George's leadership, George Ryan's leadership. And there was another guy who really got me into the appropriations slot. Had a double name, Pete Peters. And Pete Peters was a guy from the north side of Chicago, a Republican, but, you know, he was a liberal. And not a liberal, but moderate. But he was on George's leadership too. But he was the appropriations kind of guy, and he saw me and he got me into that slot. I mean, some of those guys were pretty powerful, but they came out of that that system. And after you changed, they were all gone.
Well, the other name that you oftentimes hear in that equation is Bill Redmond.
Well, Bill Redmond was a Democrat from Naperville. Or
From a
DuPage
very
County.
strong
Or DuPage,
Republican area.
Yeah. I mean, he was the leader. He was a Democrat leader. So he was part of that too. And of course, Bill Redmond disappeared after that.
So is that to say that you're a little bit nostalgic about the good old days too?
Well, you know, I was just, I always said I was kind of, I read Abraham Lincoln's book about his first term in the Illinois legislature. And of course, you know, the Long Nine and all those guys were there. And he always said the first year he was in the legislature, he looked around and shook his head and said, why in the world am I here? How did I get here? And he said the next term he was in the legislature around, he said, how did all these other guys get here? But, you know, I was pretty much wide-eyed and just trying to learn when I was at the first term. And I was doing my thing on real estate, which really gave me a way to go across the aisle. I worked with Don Clark Netsch and Jim Keene and those guys on those issues as well.
One other question about the election campaign. What kind of a campaign did you want to run? Because you're still working full-time. You didn't have much time to do this.
Look, I was a neophyte on this thing. So there were a couple women, and I found out if you find some very active political women, you know, they can tell you where to go. And of course, I was on the other side of the ERA thing, so you had to find out who was there. But you know, I had a woman from Yorkville by the name of Phyllis Oldenburg, Oldenberg. And you know, Phyllis kind of knew where to go, and so I remember I'd go to her house, and she'd say, "Okay, you got to go talk to this person, you talk to this person, talk to this person," and so, you know, they would just kind of point you in a direction. I was so busy, I really didn't have a philosophy. I was just trying to win this thing, you know, and but it was always like an upside down triangle. I always said the political process was you get one or two basic contacts. And they give you two or three more, and they get two or three more, and you get two or three more from every contact. So you're just constantly working up until you reach all the people you need to reach. And I was so busy doing that, just trying to reach the operatives. So, you know, they were precinct committeemen, they were people who controlled county or townships, and, you know.
Were you going before the civic groups? Were you making a lot of speeches?
Oh, yeah, I did all that stuff.
Was that something that came natural to you?
I always said when I first started in politics, I had two speeches. I had a 45-minute lecture, which I could sit and talk about all this stuff, or I had a 5-minute pep talk, or, you know, 2-minute pep talk, and from the coaching side. And I found out that I had to modify. You know, I couldn't give a lecture, I couldn't give a pep talk. You had to find someplace in between.
Well, I think you suggested in the book that you felt like early on you weren't necessarily the best public speaker.
No, I know. One of the things, Henry Hyde. So I had part of DuPage County. Henry Hyde was the great orator of the U.S. Congress. And so I would go over to DuPage County, and you know, Hyde would be up on the platform, and invariably I'd have to follow Henry Hyde, whether it was in Naperville Township or, you know, one of those townships over there. I mean, I'm just stumbling around trying to get, you know, hi folks, glad to see you out here. And Henry Hyde, all this stuff, you know, I felt like, you know, Abraham Lincoln following Everett Apple.
Okay, you talk quite a bit about already getting down to the legislature and kind of learning the ropes. Part of that is getting some assignments, your committee assignments. Were you in the position to ask for certain things, or do you just get assigned?
I got assigned. I just got, you know, George Ryan, you know, and I came in, you know, I wasn't the guy that was supposed to win that thing. I'm coming in as a substitute for Shoverline. And so I'm kind of the bottom of the ring, but I did get on the revenue committee because I made a relationship with Tom Ewing, and Tom Ewing was the chairman of that, and Tom actually asked to have me put on the revenue committee.
Which is one of the plum assignments, I would think.
Well, it was all taxes. And it was interesting enough, it was the taxes when you're trying to conform the state tax code to what Ronald Reagan was trying to do in the federal tax code. So it was very, very good. And then, you know, I got into this whole thing of property tax reform. And I became the lead guy on that issue. I always said that knowledge is power. If you learn something and work on something, you learn more, and then people start to come to you for information. People start to come to you for information. It really gives you a very good spot to be able to do things.
I'm looking at an excerpt from the Illinois Blue Book. I think this was from the 85, 86 edition, so that would have been your last session. That year you were on committees of revenue, which you mentioned. Financial institutions, did you have that early
Banking,
on?
yeah.
Public utilities, did you have that early
Yeah.
on?
And so then, I was doing the Public Utility Act.
And appropriations too.
Yeah.
Was that also one of the initial assignments you got?
No, that's the one when Jim Riley left, I got his spot.
Okay. So even so, the ones that I mentioned first, revenue, financial, and public utilities, there's a lot of heavy lifting to be
Well,
done.
especially in the financials, all the banking stuff, the savings and loans, and all the banking stuff was going on then.
Okay.
And one of the committees I was on before I got on I think I had to give up on appropriations, was counties and townships. So sitting on the counties and townships for, I don't know if it was 2 years or 4 years, you really got to learn a lot about local government. And you got to learn the players in local level, because every township chairman would come up and talk to you, and every county board member would come up, and so you really found out how Illinois really worked.
When the state has this reputation to this day for having, maybe only one other state has more organizations of local government. Is that a good thing, you
I
think?
think it's a good thing. Our government, our democratic system, was basically a system that felt that you got to work from the grassroots up. Township government and county government, if it works. I mean, also sometimes you get these little entities and nobody ever looks at them, so it was an area you get corruption or all these other problems. But the thought of it, the base of it, is pretty good.
Another assignment, I think I got this one from the book, the House Rules Committee.
Well, yeah, and that was interesting. I got put on a rules committee as a freshman. Why? Well, we had ERA, and anything that would come to the floor had to go through the rules committee. And George Ryan knew that I'd be a dependable vote.
Well, George Ryan was the House Speaker at the time. He ended up in 1998, being elected governor. He'd been around the system for a long time.
In between, he was lieutenant governor and secretary of state. Probably held more public offices in Illinois than anybody else.
He's in jail now, but I think we'll start with George Ryan. Tell us about George Ryan at that time, the Ryan that you knew.
Well, George Ryan, when I first came, was kind of a rough and gruff guy. And he was a businessman. He was a local pharmacist in Kankakee County. Became chairman of the county board, and then got elected to the legislature, and ended up being the speaker. And so he was speaker when I was there, and I was kind of intimidated by him a little bit. He just, he'd never get a sentence out of him. He was kind of like a Pate Phillip, only not quite as crass. And but just kind of a rough and that's how George was. And but there was something that happened. I was on the revenue committee, and Tom Ewing, who was the chairman of the revenue committee, had a plan, and we wanted to put our property tax reform and the ability to move, I think, the inheritance tax, basically the reforms that Reagan had done. We were all propped up. We couldn't move them out of committee. I mean, just because we had enough Republicans who were controlled by the Democrats on our revenue committee, that couldn't get anything done. And so he had a plan on how to do it. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But he had to go give a speech. So we were on the floor late one night, probably late May, before the July 1st, or maybe it was June. It was late. And so I had been around and sat through there, and another person, Doris Carpiel, Karpiel, was a woman from Itasca, DuPage County. We were on the revenue committee with Tom, and Lee Daniels, and trying to think the other guy, who was actually our floor leader. He could argue either side of any argument. Good guy, very smart guy. But I said, watch him out. I'll think of his name as we talk through here. But they were going to move because they thought this legislation ought to move quicker out of the revenue committee. So they were going to have a motion on the floor late at night when Ewing wasn't there to go around the chairman and bring this legislation to the floor. So an end run. And I thought, oh, here I am. I'm kind of a rookie on this thing. And so I don't think the speaker wasn't there either. Ryan wasn't on the floor, and I think Lee Daniels was in the chair. And so all of a sudden they bring this legislation up and to discharge from committee. So I get up and, okay, we can't do this, and I get Carpeel to help me, and Ewing isn't there, and I object. So you have to have a unanimous consent. And they were asking for UC to bring it up. He had cut a deal across the aisle to do this. And so you're making an end round around. I got to object, and then they overrode the objection, and I had then brought up a whole bunch of amendments. And, so I fought this thing. It's late at night, and they could see that they were going to get it passed. And I knew enough about parliamentary procedure to throw a monkey wrench into it.
But you're a freshman. I mean,
Well,
a little
yeah.
bit heady stuff for
Well, it was, but I thought, gee, somebody's got to do this. You just can't let it go. So I had help. Babe Woodyard, who was on the committee, he was from over Danville area. Doris Carpeel and we kind of got up together, and we were kind of all guys on this committee to help. Ewing was our chairman, but we were able to stop it. But I kind of led that. Well, I didn't get the great friendship of Lee Daniels for doing that, but they respected me. And Ryan called me in the next day. Of course, Ewing came back. That he was giving a graduation speech in someplace down in East Central Illinois. And he was grateful that he understood what happened. And Ryan called me into his office. Oh, shit, what's this about? The next morning. He said, you did the right thing. You caused some havoc on the floor, and you weren't very smooth about it. But you did the right thing, so don't worry about it. It was just kind of a attaboy type of thing. I don't know. The next thing I knew, I'm on a rules committee. Yeah. But the reason, we had Artie Telser and Pete Peters, who were for the ERA. So he had to have somebody that he could count on. They'd vote. So he decided he could count on me. And so I voted against the ERA 17 times my first term, because I was in the Rules Committee. And every time it would come in the Rules Committee, I had to vote against it.
So that it wouldn't get to the floor?
It wouldn't get to the floor.
So did it ever make it to the floor that year?
And we had Susan Catania and all these people who were on the Republican side who would stand up and protest, and all the Republican women, Suzanne Deutschler, and all these people would get up on the floor and protest. And
that was 81. Did you have a lot of outsiders?
Oh yeah,
there as
we
well?
had we had protests. For all spring we had these protests, and a hunger strike was African American guy.
Well, the hunger strike was 82.
Well, it was during that period of time. So, you had the hunger strike going on. You had people throwing blood on the house door, buckets of blood. I mean, just chaos. And you never went in through the main chamber and up because there's so many people in the rotunda that you just didn't want to deal. So you always had to come in the back way and up the back stairs and to get in. But it was just chaos for 2 years.
And did it eat up a lot of the energy in the legislature because of that?
It was always, George Ryan, another thing, he ended up running for lieutenant governor, and Susan Catania was his opponent. So you had these two people, one of the speaker and one who was leading the opposition, and all of a sudden they were political, enemies on the same side of the aisle. So you had all these splits, and so we spent a lot of time fighting the ERA, but we also did all the Reagan stuff. Finally, with Ewing, we were able to get it through the committee the right way. Got all the Reagan tax cuts. I did the property tax thing. We were doing a lot of stuff.
It was a busy legislative year, that sounds like.
Yeah, very busy.
You mentioned earlier your chief of staff, and here's my question on that. I have always understood that in Illinois, at least, the way the legislature is constructed, if you will, is that the 4 caucus leaders, the House minority and the majority leader,
they have all the staff.
They have all the staff. Did you have much of a staff beyond that?
No, but when I became the appropriations 2 is all the human services side. So, I mean, it had all the education stuff, you had all the welfare issues, you had children and family services, and all these things that were under your jurisdiction. And the other side was basically what I call hardware. It was so agriculture, highways, other types of things, prisons, and so it was really the cement blocks of government. And but my budget was probably 2/3 or 3/4 of the budget.
When you were on appropriations too?
Yeah.
And when you were first starting out, did you have an office here in the local district as well as something?
You had an office in a district, and I could hire one person in the district. I had an office in Springfield, and Bob Custer was my office mate, so every 2 members had one secretary.
Remember who your secretary was?
Yeah.
Marilyn?
Marilyn.
Markline?
Well, Marilyn Markline was my secretary here. I think I'm trying to think of what my other secretary was named. Her name might have been Marilyn too, I'm not sure.
As far as dealing with constituencies.
Debbie. My other was Debbie. I think she got a divorce. I forgot what her last name was.
In constituent services, was the office here in the local district the most important?
Yeah. And that was the other part. I spent a lot of time. When I wasn't in Springfield, I was in my office. And so, you did all the Lions clubs in Kiwanis and did all the local speaking engagements. You went to all the, the county fairs and all the events. And so you had to get around and and talk to people. And I always felt that retail politics was the most important part of representation. Because if you're on the streets and in the grocery stores and in the barber shops, then you knew really what people were talking about and what the real issues were. So there were two sides, the work that you did in Springfield, but there was also the work that you did back in the district. And my district spread from Geneva, Illinois, which is way up here, for a 100,000 member district. It spread from Geneva, Illinois, part of Aurora, through Naperville, back down to around Plainfield, Illinois, into Troy Township, all the way down to Shanahan, which is in the middle of Will County. So it was a big district.
This was the district you had when you first ran?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a map from, again, I think it's the 84, 86 time frame, so that would be a different district at that time.
Yeah, it was. This was the 82.
After the redistricting?
Yeah, I got, redistricting. It was interesting because I had it was the third, was that 39? Yeah. This is 39, so I got part of Aurora, and then.
Well, I have the representative district 82.
Oh, it was 82. 39th was its.
And would that put you in the senatorial district for 41?
Yeah. So there's 41. That's Senate. So 82 is.
Yeah, I had a hard time trying to sort that out.
No, it has to be right.
Again, we're looking at this map right out of the Illinois Blue Book.
Oh, this is Chicago. So is this the
the one on the left-hand side is the collar
district.
counties.
This representative districts. Okay, so where is it? Here's 80.
And you were 81. Excuse me, you were 82. With the district office in Oswego.
Yeah.
Well, while you're looking at that,
Well, I'm trying to find where the heck it is here.
Well, I don't feel so bad at being confused.
Oh, here
looking
it
at
is, right here. So this is my district right here.
Right
here. So I can't read those townships. So I have, this is DuPage. Yeah, this is DuPage County that sticks over here like this. Oh no, this is Oswego Township. So I got Oswego Township, Bristol Township, Kendall Township. I live right here on the river, right here. And then in Neossi, and I go down to Will County. This is Joliet right here. So and then I come up into Naperville, and you see I squiggle up all the way up into here. So this is around the east side of Aurora, I think.
And again, that would be after the 81 redistricting.
Yeah, matter of fact, I go up into this is Lisle. So I go from here over to Lisle.
Wow.
This is what I go up in the backside of Naperville, Maple Road, and this is all the area in Bolingbrook, which is starting to develop. And so then this is all Bolingbrook, Illinois over here. And I remember knocking on doors in Bolingbrook and people say, well, who's the precinct captain and where do I get my garbage can? So you knew exactly where those people were all coming from. It was a new town. It was literally a new town.
Well, you look at maps like this and you realize the importance of the redistricting, and you realize that gerrymandering has gone on, but that looks pretty tame compared to the gerrymandering you were talking about yesterday in this latest go-around.
Well, this is legislatively, and this map was gerrymandered too. It was gerrymandered by the Democrats, basically to pack these districts. So I ended up with a pretty good Republican district, but it was packed. It was packed so that you could have Leroy Van Dyne and the guy from Morris to run as they could run as Democrats.
Okay.
Let me say one more thing about this map. This is a legislative map. In '82, I was in the legislature. Never dreamed that I was ever going to run for Congress. But I showed you, I lived right here on this area. This is the Fox River that runs down, let's see, I lost my place. Oh, right here, this little line right here. This is the Fox River. You got a pen? Let me mark it for you. So I lived right here. And what they did, they brought my house and came up and ran a finger in my house like this, and ran in the congressional district and ran it all the way to Chicago, in the George O'Brien district. Now I don't know why they ever did it, but they did it. So when I decided to run for Congress, I had two choices. I could run in the Will County side, where my house was, because that finger came. I could throw a quarter out of three sides of my house, and be a different congressional district than where I lived. So, or I could move over to where Yorkville and Kendall County was, where my base is, and Aurora, where I kind of grew up, and we had our business, and Naperville and that area. I could move over there and run out on the other side. So I had to move across the river. I moved about 300 yards across the Fox River and bought a place. So I ended up running for Congress without any money and owning 2 houses at a time when you couldn't sell houses.
From your description of that, though, those lines weren't drawn necessarily with you in mind, were they?
Well, that was always a conundrum, because I don't know why they'd come up and pick my house up.
Yeah.
Just a finger around my house. If they did, they came up, picked my house up, and took me into this Will County district that wasn't mine.
Maybe they were even more prescient than you were at the time.
It was the last thing on my mind. I ever thought I'd be running for Congress.
You have this interesting layout for the types of Democrats in Illinois at the time that you discovered when you got down the legislature as well, and I'd like to have you lay that out for us.
Well, I talked about it a little bit before,
right.
When the bigger house. So you basically had 3 times the Democrats. You had the machine Democrats that came out of Chicago. You had guys like Laz Murphy, who were really the union Democrats. I mean, the old-time labor union guys who worked up through the system, became labor guys. I think McPike was kind of the same guy. Again, he's a very interesting guy. I mean, he's a guy who would give you a shedding light, because he worked with Cullerton, he worked with Madigan, so he could give you a background on all these guys. So, they're the Union Democrats. Then there were the Maverick Democrats, the Glenn Schneiders and all these guys who were basically just pretty much they're school teachers and just people who were more pretty much moderates or liberals, and got elected as moderates liberals because they were the minority vote in a majority district.
Were they the ones who would like to self-identify as independent Democrats?
Yeah. Independent of Chicago, basically.
Well, the couple categories you used in the book, and I think this last category they would fit into. One would be the leftover 1960s revolutionaries.
Yeah.
And the other group, the terminology I found interesting, the quasi-intellectual college professor types.
Oh yeah.
Why the phrase quasi-intellectual?
Well, they thought they were intellectuals. I always said those liberals.
That's a bit demeaning.
They always think, can I just let that go? That's okay.
Well, we can pause it here.
Let's hold for a second. Persistent.
Oh, persistent. There you go.
All right.
Go ahead.
Quasi-intellectual. A lot of those guys thought they were a lot smarter than everybody else. That was their own self-assessment of whether they're intellectual or not. But
well, the other group that there he goes again.
You want to talk about this?
Yeah, that'd be fun. Okay, we took a short break, and we're going to get to C.L. McCormick, but I had one more question about the Democrats.
Yeah.
And there's, you mentioned it already, this strong tradition of Southern Democrats, and I don't know where they would fit into that equation.
You had a few Southern Democrats, but basically, I don't think that Jim McPike, I keep bringing that name up, he represented downstate Illinois, basically all in Southwest Illinois. But McPike was a Vietnam War. He was a graduate of the Air Force Academy. He was a jet pilot. He was a jet pilot during World War II, the Vietnam War. I mean, he was a pretty seasoned veteran. But he came out of the Union. He was basically his base. I don't think he came out of the Union, but his base was Union, local Democrat Party Union base.
A lot of coal.
Yeah, the coal and just
Industrial
unions down there. And so then, get down in Southern Illinois, there's diverse interests. I mean, there's a lot of agriculture and stuff down there. But even the Southern Illinois Republicans were the minority guys. And so those guys were kind of independent guys. They were really kind of built their political base in their districts. Bob Winchester was one of them. And Bob Winchester was a more senior guy. He was my seatmate when I first came to the Congress or legislature. And Bob was saying, look, I got all these committee meetings I got to be at. I don't know if they were committee meetings or not, but he was never on the floor. So I had to vote a switch all the time. And he said, just watch C.L. McCormick and Jim Ray. Now, Jim Ray was a Democrat from that area down there. And he said, they'll play back and forth in their switch all the time, but when it comes down to the last second, put my switch with C.L. McCormick. That's what I did. So I voted Bob Winchester on issues. I mean, if issues were really Southern, those issues that we didn't know how somebody wanted. A lot of them were just partisan issues, and you just did them. But most votes weren't partisan votes. But I always voted, Winchester with C.L. McCormick. C.L. McCormick was a colorful guy, and he would get up and once in a while give a classic speech. And I remember there was a thing about mosquito abatements. And he had a great speech about mosquito, but these huge mosquitoes would come down and pick up these mules and just carry them up into the sky. And I mean, it was just funny.
Well, the stories are that most people wouldn't pay any attention to whoever was speaking on the floor, but they'd pay attention when CL got up.
Yeah. Another guy that people paid attention to was Cullerton, who's now President of the Senate. But Cullerton could do imitations of anybody. And this is back when he had the big house. Things were a little bit more wild. And Cullerton, he would call people and imitate Jimmy Carter, call Democrats and ask them for a vote. And they thought they were talking to Jimmy Carter. And he would give up, and he could imitate Taylor Pouncey. Taylor Pouncey was an African-American guy from Chicago and had a real high, squeaky voice. And Cullerton could get up and give Taylor Pouncey imitations. Then when McPike became majority leader, Cullerton ended up being the floor guy, so he had to clean up his act, and he didn't do the imitations. But he was hilarious, a funny guy.
Well, a lot of these names had incredible longevity.
Yeah.
You mentioned Madigan, who's now the speaker, has been forever.
Yeah.
John Cullerton has been around forever. Okay.
I went, just a sidelight, when I went back after I was speaker, we had a capital bill that we're trying to do because we had $9 billion in public works money, highway money for Illinois. And Blagojevich had spent most of the highway trust funds on other things. They would borrow them. So we needed to get money, capital into the highway trust fund so we could match the federal dollars. So we needed to raise $2 or $3 billion, $1 federal for or state for $4 federal. Okay, so the 4-to-1 federal state match. So we had to raise, to get the $9 billion, we had to raise $2 or $3 billion to get that done. Well, what happened, Blagojevich at that time had made so many enemies, we weren't going to get the Democrats to vote with him because Madigan wasn't with him. But, the Senate was with him. And I was down there trying to, me and Glenn Pichard, who was the president of Southern Southern Illinois University. We're trying to get this Capitol built done. And I'd go down on the rotunda, and I'd look around, and it was the same faces that were there 20 years before. I mean, when I left, I saw the same people that were there, a little older, but they're the same people. I mean, it was just amazing. They never went away.
Well, some more questions about the personalities that were involved. And we mentioned Bill Redmond. He was the minority leader when George Ryan was Speaker,
Yep.
but only because that was before the cutback amendment.
Right.
Your opinion about Bill Redmond?
Yeah, I was a freshman, and all these guys were bigger than life, and but he was a down-to-earth guy. I mean, he wasn't a flamboyant guy. He obviously had the respect of the Democrats, and he could work with the Chicago Democrats. He could bring the downstate Democrats together. So I think what my impression of Redmond, and I wasn't very intimate in the process, and that was the other side of the aisle, and really didn't know how all that stuff worked. But I think Redmond was a guy who could bring people together. I was very impressed with him. He was a decent guy.
And the other one, when you're talking about the Democrats' leadership, Mike Madigan.
Well, Mike Madigan, first of all, he came out of the Chicago machine. I mean, he was Daley's guy. And I'm trying to think of the guy who was his partner with Daley and ended up being the chairman of the Chicago Board of Trade. Dan was an Irishman, very Irish. Maybe I'll think of it in this discussion. But it was, Madigan was a very shrewd guy, and you never knew where he was going to be. But he was always putting stuff together. I mean, putting things together. And never showed his hand on anything. So you would go talk to him, and he'd have these kind of look at you and kind of squint his eyes at you, and he's kind of these crystal blue eyes, and he'd kind of twinkle at you, and you never knew what was behind him. He just never showed his hand. And if I wanted to get anything done with Madigan, I'd go to McPike, because I could sit down and talk to McPike. But, I ended up doing some things, especially the Public Utility Act, and I know I did it because Madigan trusted me, or I wouldn't have been the chairman of that committee. Where he trusted me, he didn't trust his own people like Ellis Levin and Don Clark Netsch and those folks.
Well, the interesting thing about Madigan is he's been around forever. He's likely to be around for quite a few more years. And if you talk to most of the people on the inside of Illinois politics and ask them who's the most powerful person in Illinois politics, for a long time, they've been saying Mike Madigan.
Absolutely. I mean, it's even when Daley was there, I mean, traditionally the old Daley died before I came to the legislature, but the Chicago mayor really had the strings on most of the Democrats. When the mayors became weak, otherwise the Snow Queen, and then Washington, and then all
Jane Byrne
and those folks. I mean, Madigan really rose out of there and took that power base. And not only was he, the speaker, and the speaker has incredible power because the speaker has the ability to control whatever piece of legislation comes to the floor, either his own control or the Rules Committee, which we talked about when we talked about the ERA amendment. So he can control what happens, whether your bill's called, whether it's not called, whether it gets amended or it's not amended. The speaker controls that. So it's a tremendous issue on the political issues. He has that control. And if you don't pass through the House, it's not going to pass through the Senate. And it's not going to, even if it comes to a conference or agreement, if the speaker doesn't agree on it, it's not going to happen. So he has that immense control. So anything that happens politically or legislatively, the speaker controls it. Same way in the U.S. House. To a lesser degree, but same way. And the second thing Madigan has done is the chairman of the party. So if you're going to get slated by the Democratic Party, you got to go through Mike Madigan. Anybody. Or you're a township assessor, or you're running for mayor of Carbondale, or anything. Mike Madigan is a guy who has some input, if more in Chicago, less than downstate, but he has input of who the candidate's going to be. Because the Democrats do slate.
Could I get you to define what you mean by slating?
Slating is saying, this is my guy, and this is the guy that's going to run for this office. and basically clears away the opposition.
Well, the classic stories, and you said you read a lot about Richard J. Daley when you got to the job, and the classic stories about Richard J. Daley was the process in which the slate makers did their job. That, again, one of those smoke-filled rooms, a bunch of people sitting around the table, and aspirants would come in there and they would want to have they'd want to run for Attorney General or Secretary of State, and they had to go through the mayor of Chicago.
Yeah.
Was it still in that the way it worked when you were there?
Well, no, because when the mayor became weak, when the old mayor died and Jane Byrne showed that she really didn't have the power to do it, got beat. Can I make a side story?
Sure.
Keep on this thing, but a side story was Taylor Pouncey. I told you he was this African-American guy from Chicago. He was a garbage truck guy. Worked on a garbage truck. Didn't drive it. He collected garbage. He was sat in the back of rode in the back of the truck. Big, bulky African-American guy. Had a real high voice, just like that, you know. And Cullerton did a great imitation of him. And he was on the Revenue Committee. And I was I kind of whipped for Ewing on that committee, find out where we could get votes and stuff. So I could go back to Taylor Pouncey once in a while and pick up a vote for committees and get a vote for. So we had a vote up, and it was a vote that really was a pretty important thing, and it was one of the. And I went back and I said, oh, Tom, I'll go back to Pouncey and see if we can pick a vote up on this. Because we had a couple of city votes that we really couldn't count on our side. And so I went back to Taylor Pouncey. I said, can you help us? I said, you know, I come from Chicago, and before I had this job, I was a mownback. I said, mownback? Yeah, mownback. I said, what's a mownback? He said, I was in the back of the garbage truck saying, mownback. He says, you know, it was a long way from the back of that garbage truck to down here. He says, but you know, if I vote wrong, it's a short way back. And sure enough, when changed, and it was before Daley was mayor, but when
Harold
Washington came, there was a guy named Jimmy Bulljive Taylor, who came out of the House, went to the Senate, and Bulljive Taylor was, you know, Jane Byrne's person. When Washington came in, he got demoted. So he got pushed from the Senate to the House, and Pouncey, who had that House seat, went back to the garbage truck.
Did the Republicans have anything like the old slate maker process that the Democrats had?
As close as you could ever get was the 4 county chairmen who got together and had to pick a candidate. But you know, that would happen once in a while. But they really didn't slate. I mean, one of the things about Republicans, basically, whether you're talking about congressional races or legislative races, is somebody that gets a bug in their ear and decides to run. I mean, they really don't come up through a process. I think, you know, I was unusual, but I also am typical. That somebody decided as a businessman, you know, it might have 4 or 5 people in a race. And, you know, you might be somebody's guy here or somebody's guy there, but it's basically best man wins.
You've alluded to you discussed quite a bit of this already, but I wonder if you can get us onto local issues or maybe state level issues and how Chicago versus suburbs versus the rest of the state, the dynamics worked its way out there in specific issues.
Well, a lot of the stuff, especially in you know, one of my frustrations, let's go back to property tax evaluation, and it has a very, well, let me go back and finish on Mike Madigan.
Okay.
Okay. So Madigan not only is the speaker, he's not only the state chairman, does all the slating, but he also controls all the money. So if somebody goes and raises money for legislative purposes, they don't have if you know, XYZ doesn't go out and Mr. Jimmy Jones or whatever his name, he doesn't go out and do a fundraiser in his district. Madigan does the fundraisers in Springfield, especially all the PAC money and everything, and regional things. So all the funding goes through Madigan. So if you're not his guy, you don't get funded.
Which makes you beholden to Madigan.
Absolutely. So there's statewide allegiance to Madigan, because if you're not with Madigan, you don't get your campaign paid for. If you don't get your campaign paid for and somebody's against you and he's before that other guy, even if you're incumbent, you're gone.
Which makes him an incredibly powerful politician.
You're not a speaker, you're king. Seriously. And people have to decide. You heard all especially up here, all the TV commercials and stuff about Mike Madigan. And, if you want to get Madigan, you have to vote against a Democrat. And, he picked up 7 seats. It didn't work. So the question is, what happens to government when one person dominates it for so long? I'm not saying it. I'm just saying that's a rhetorical question. Is it good for government when one guy controls everything and you know is there determination? And the questions in what happened in this last political process. Look at Illinois, the laughing stock of the nation. We got the largest debt of the nation. We have our pensions aren't funded. We're in a political chaos. We're just trying to raise taxes. We raise taxes. We push business out. Have we had the same stuff for too long? I mean, it's a political question, and so but being one person in power for too long creates that type of situation. And I like Mike Madigan. We've gotten along. We have I can't say that we're close, but we do have a relationship. We're not enemies. And but that's a serious question, I think.
Okay, getting back then to Chicago, suburbs, downstate, and working through the issues that come out of that dynamic.
Well, anything that you pass, there's something in the legislature called, cities more than 2 million are exempt. So almost anything that would have any impact on Chicago, and especially if you do stuff on the revenue side, on property taxes, this type of stuff, everything you come to cook, anything in that issue that you do in state legislation, Chicago gets exempted because it has to be exempted to get it through the committee or get it on the floor, because Madigan won't let it on if what you're trying to do changes Chicago other than the way that Chicago wants it to be done. So, you'll find you go through legislation, you find almost anything that's statewide that has some effect on cities. And you'll read that legislation somewhere, and it'll say with the exemption of any city bigger than 1 million or bigger than 2 million. Or counties bigger than.
One of the things that's been in discussion a lot lately, and you mentioned the pension crisis that the state has, and a big part of that is the teacher's pension. And you did talk about tax assessments and all. My question here, and my confusion has always been, why Chicago, their teacher's pension system is funded differently from the rest of the state, and the rest of the state basically is beholden to what they get from the state government, and Chicago isn't. Can you sort that out for us?
Chicago is based on, they get it from state government too, but they get it appropriated, not what the teachers pay in. So this is not my area of expertise, but we have a defined benefit, not a defined contribution. So the benefits in Illinois, if you're a teacher, I was a teacher for 16 years. I have a benefit for 16 years, so I get about maybe $1,000 a month. I can't live on it, but for 16 years, that's what I got. If I would have been there for 25 years or 30 years, it would have been better. My wife taught for 35 years. She gets $4,000 a month on a pension, but she paid into it. But part of the thing is that they pay into it, and the local school board pays into it, and then the state makes a contribution, and that money goes into funds. Well, what's happened, they've borrowed out of those pension funds. So Blagojevich and others have basically borrowed out of that system.
I understood it wasn't borrowing, they just didn't put in their share of the contribution.
Well, that's the same thing as borrowing.
Okay.
Okay, so they don't put their in there, so all of a sudden those pension systems are in deficit. And so what the liability is, $50 billion, or I don't know what it is in the future, they can't even begin to do it. So they're going to have to change what their benefits, defined benefits are, or either from, I'm talking in legislative terms now, either go from defined benefits or start to change the system to defined contributions. So if a guy puts in $40 a month towards his pension, he gets that, he knows what his contribution is, and he knows what the state contribution is, he knows what he's going to get out in the long term. Before, the pension systems, and there's a real problem, I think, with the Illinois pension systems, because say a superintendent of schools making $100,000 a year, and the last 3 years because your pension's based on the last 3 years. So the school system on his last year or his last 2 years will give him $300,000. that's part of an incentive to get out of there. But if his pension's based on $300,000, then his pension's 3 times what it should be, and because of what his real work record is and what the real market is. And so and a lot of state legislators or state guys, especially when people were double dipping, they were working for the city of Chicago, they're sewer commissioners or this or that, at the same time in the legislature, so they're getting a legislative pension and a state pension and kind of double dipping on those pensions. And then the last couple of years of their local, they'll double it up or triple it, and then they have this huge pension coming from the state.
And to use that example, is this the local school board that's jacking up his pay, and yet it's basically the state government that has to pick up the bill for it?
Well, the school board pays some of it because they pay the upfront $300,000 for 2 years.
But they don't have to worry about the pension later on.
Yeah. So that's a problem. I mean, they do, and it's just not a downstate problem. It's also a Chicago problem, because these guys would go out and I'm not sure how all the Chicago pensions work, but anything that's state-based, they could go out and they'll get double salaries the last year or 2 years, and then they get those high pensions. And there's some state legislatures. There's a guy who was a state senator from Elgin, and I think the state senator's salary was like $30,000 a year or $39,000 a year. Well, you got to go get a state job that was $90,000 a year, take it for 3 months, and that becomes the basis for his pension.
Well, part of my confusion then is
Bob Michler did the same thing. Went from the state senate, went to work for governor as a veterans rep, whatever the hell that was, He sat at home and maybe made some speeches on November 11th. But he, for a year or whatever, he got this high salary, so that boosted his pension.
Part of my question then, and this is much more about what the discussion is today in terms of trying to get out of this pension nightmare, is that the Democrats have proposed, let's give that funding of the pension obligation back to the local government and not have the state involved with it.
Sure. So what happens is that all of a sudden Chicago's pensions are paid through, like they always do, with the state revenue, just because that state revenue pays for the property tax. Because, and here's another thing in Chicago. Most of the power brokers in Chicago are Catholic. Come out of the southwest side of Chicago, the old Irish base, or the northwest side.
Bridgeport.
And the Polish area in the north, the old Roszkowski territory. Basically, most of their base send their kids to parochial schools. So if you're sending your kids to parochial schools, you don't want to pay high property taxes. So property taxes in Chicago are artificially low. And so in a sense, because you lower property taxes, you actually give people an invisible incentive to send their kids to parochial schools. You follow what I'm saying? It's almost it's a hidden subsidy.
Yes.
So what's left are the public schools, where the Hispanics and the blacks and anybody that's not Catholic ends up going to. So you have when you talk to a lot of Democrat legislators in Chicago, they don't talk about their district. They talk about what parish they come from. That's just their thought. And so, it's a different world. And so, in the public schools, their pension, their funding for public schools come through the state because of the school formula, and at the same time, the funding for their pensions comes through the state. And so, what Madigan wants to do now is say, okay, instead of the state taking up the pensions, local school districts have to do it. If local school district has it, goes back on the back of the property taxpayers, the homeowners.
But
do you follow me?
I do, but that's not my understanding of. I'd always heard, at least recently, I've heard that Chicago was always picking up its pension expenses already. So when the state says let's push that back down to local levels, that's always the way it's been for Chicago. It would only impact the rest of the state. That's how I've understood it to be.
I would think, and look, I told you pensions aren't, especially state pensions, that's not my area of expertise. I did some federal pension reform, but I didn't do state. Tom Cross would be the guy to talk about this. But I think part of those pensions are picked up through the state school formula. So sure, yeah, it's paid through the money that they get, but that money is what they get from the state.
Okay. Well, I was the one who took us down this rabbit hole, I guess, but that's part of my curiosity,
Yeah.
and it has more to do with the current discussion than maybe it was at the time you were there.
Yeah. Well, it was the time. Sure, it was a discussion when I was there, not pensions so much, because one of the things we did was make sure that we met our pension, our pension liabilities. We made sure that when I was appropriations, that money was set aside and went to pensions.
Did the issue of, hey, we need to bail out the Chicago school system, did that come up during the years you were in the Illinois
because
legislature?
the Chicago school system was just in shambles, and there was this guy, African American guy from Chicago, and I'm trying to think of what his name was. Double H. But this guy was half in a bag all the time, he was smoking marijuana all the time. But his big issue was 51 school districts. So every ward, I think it was a ward. Is there 51 wards in Chicago? But every political unit in Chicago should have their own school district, elected school district. So you have local control. Before that, you had the city that controlled everything. And so he was always pushing that. And I remember one night, it was late in the session, and he had this bill on the floor. And, every 4th of July, Springfield has this big celebration with fireworks and everything. If you live in Springfield, they still do it.
Down at the Capitol.
At the Capitol. So we were having debate, and this bill was up, and all of a sudden, it's about midnight or whatever the time the fireworks go off, 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and these fireworks go off, almost right over the Capitol. And it boom, and the big chandeliers in the old Capitol, like this, and the building was shaking, and these fireworks were going off. and this guy's right in the middle of his speech, and he always kind of talks slow and drag it out. He looks at me, shit, I guess we're not getting this passed.
Well, we're right at 2 hours already. We just went past that time frame. But I wanted to ask a little bit about some of the personal sides of this. Where did you, when you were going down to Springfield, where did you live?
I first couple, when I was going down and going to school, teaching school, I was staying in a Red Roof Inn every night. And then I got an apartment. Actually, it was Bob Mitchell's apartment. He had to leave and was out, so I got his apartment. And it was right next to the Sangamo Club. And it's not there anymore, but it was an apartment building that was sitting right there, and it was on top of a tile store, or they made like bathroom tiles or sold and linoleum and stuff like that. And so I think there were 3 floors, and I was I don't know if I was the top floor or not, but you had to walk up a lot of stairs to get there. And so I stayed in that. There was a 1-bedroom apartment. So I never cooked a meal there all the years I was there, but that's where I stayed. And you were down there 3 days a week and back home. And so I was there then my first term. And the second term, I'm trying to think of the guy that I told you that was Lee Daniels' buddy. And he was a school teacher from Bensonville, Illinois. But he and Ewing, Tom Ewing was my friend, and Daniels lived in his house over on MacArthur Boulevard. And so when Daniels moved out, got his own place, and this other guy was still there because I was upstairs, so it was a 2-bedroom apartment. So I got this place, and so I lived with Ewing, and so the last 2 years. Oh, the first, how'd that work? So the first year I was John, a guy from Rockford, John, a House member. Then he ran for Congress, and he got beat up in the Northwest area, in a congressional district. He owned this house. So Jim Riley, the guy that was my seatmate on appropriations, Riley and I shared. There was upstairs, so there was 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. So I rented a room from this guy upstairs, from John. I'll think of his name later. But so I was there first, And then I went and got this place at the Sangamo Club. So I think I was at John's place for a year, maybe the Sangamo Club for a year. And then I moved. I think the last 3 years I lived with Ewing in that apartment when Daniels went out and got his own apartment.
Now, in the old days, and I'm thinking 1950s, 60s time frame, maybe into the early 70s as well, there was a definite lifestyle that you hear about a lot.
Into the 80s.
Into the 80s.
So when I was interning with Frick Rockberg, I stayed at the old, I think it was the Governor's Hotel. I think it was the name of it.
Was that the Republican Hotel?
I don't remember. There was a Republican hotel. Was there a Washington Hotel? Was there?
No, that one doesn't ring a bell.
But I was the governor. I'm sure it was the governor. There were Democrats there too, but that's where people lived, and they not only lived there. I mean, they had their deals made there, and the lobbyists met them there and bought their drinks there, and some of them had their girlfriends there, and but that was the lifestyle. Well, they're about ready to tear down that hotel, but I remember I stayed there this summer. But you know, they rehabbed a lot of old Springfield, and those hotels got torn down.
So some of that old lifestyle was still going on when you first got there?
Yeah. But it was just on the edge. It was changing.
Okay. And I assume Gene was up here the whole time?
Yeah, absolutely.
The decision made right at the beginning that
Well,
that would be?
Not many people moved down there because there's some people. I mean, Deutsch, I remember she bought an apartment down there in the Lincoln Towers before she ever got elected before she ever got to the primaries, and you know, she was picking her furniture out and that kind of stuff. And I thought, oh, that's kind of presumptuous, but she won. But you know, so she and her husband went down there. Her husband was there all the time. Wally was part of Suzanne. A little weird, but anyway. So I mean, Wally sat with her at her desk down on the floor, and it was just anyway. So some people did. Some people spent a lot of time there, but most people went back home.
Let's finish off with this one and have you talk about the 1982 campaign, and this is post-redistricting for you.
Well, we're reapportioned, and so all of a sudden I went from this district that ran from Geneva all the way down to Shanahan, which is a long stretch, very diverse. I went from Geneva, kind of went around to Aurora, picked up part of Naperville Township, went then from Naperville over to, how did I go through Wheatland Township, down through Wheatland Township to the west side of Joliet, because I had everything everything that was black and brown in my old district in Joliet. It was another packed district, so they took Democrats away, put it in the Republican district. So this was something that was a portion in 1972. So the last district I had in the last big house. And it was a big district because you had the whole Senate district. And it was Michler's district too. It went all the way down to Shanahan, which is way down along the Illinois River in Illinois, in Will County. It was a long district, almost Grundy County. And very diverse. So I got that. And then, you know, there's a lot of hard feelings in Will that I got the seat. And the Will County guys always thought that seat should have been Gould. So the guy who was the chairman of the Democratic Party was a guy named, he was my opponent. And so anyway, they draw this district, which has a little bit of the backside of Naperville, Wheatland Township, most of Kendall County, but then picks up all of Bolingbrook. And this guy starts with a K. So he basically had his finger in drawing the district through the Joliet side. And there was a guy named Harry Leinenweber who ended up being a federal judge. And I'm sure that Harry had his hands in the reapportionment too, because he was a senior member on the Republican side. So, you know, he's always talking about, well, our guy got screwed. But and I had the west side of Aurora in that district as well. So the district was drawn basically so that I couldn't win it. And this guy Kavanaugh was from Bolingbrook, who was the president of the school board in Bolingbrook, and also I think he was the chairman of the Democratic Party at that time, took over from Yangus. So Kavanaugh was my opponent. He helped draw the map, and was my opponent. There was another guy then running from Bolingbrook for the state senate, and that was he's now the mayor of Bolingbrook, still the mayor of Bolingbrook. So he was running against a guy from Downers Grove, Ray Hudson. Ray Hudson went from the House to the Senate. Hudson was aligned with Mishler. They're all World War II guys and Veterans Affairs guys. So you had a very diverse base. And so I remember talking to Dallas. Dallas was helping me in this race, and I said, "Gee, I'd like to," and I also had Plainfield. At Plainfield, then in this new district, the Democrats were drawing this thing in Will County, so it would tilt their way. But our family business, I had an uncle that had a big restaurant in Bolingbrook, right outside White Fence Farm, which is very famous and big restaurant. Everybody knows the Hastert name is very famous. There was another guy named Hastert, Hassert, who was a county board chairman, and then his nephew was very active in politics, became a House member for a long time. So Hastert and Hastert people didn't make the difference. They always thought my name was over there. They always thought I was Hastert anyway. And so the name was familiar. And in Plainfield, we've been in the restaurant business in Plainfield. I knew everybody in Plainfield. And so they thought that they drew this map with a Will County. And in Wheatland Township, I knew a lot of people in Wheatland Township because where I grew up, right across the fence was Wheatland Township. So I had a lot of farm people and base people that I knew in Wheatland Township. And it was a growth area. Both Naperville and Bolingbrook were growing together basically in Wheatland Township. So a lot of new people. And, I worked at it really hard. And it's interesting because there's an old wrestling community. So I knew some wrestling coaches and some officials, and they helped, in that area. So I could take help wherever I could get it. And we beat Kavanaugh pretty bad in that race. And so that was the last time in the legislature that I was really opposed. This is the third term I ran. I wasn't even opposed. Well, I did. I had a guy from Naperville, but he wasn't. So the fourth term that I ran, I was already in the primary, and I was unopposed. So dummy me, I go to run for Congress.
And the equation changes. But we'll get to that session next time around. Okay, great. Enjoyed it. Any final comments for today?
I we covered kind of a whole dispersion of people, but
we've covered a lot, but there's a lot more to cover. So. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.